Hello, I'm Colleen Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association Insights podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Association Insights podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Gallagher, and joined today by my co-host, Megan Henning. We're continuing our March Leadership Series today and really excited for our guest, Anne Reinke. Anne is the president and CEO at IANA, the Intermodal Association of North America. IANA is the only organization that represents the combined interests of the intermodal freight transportation industry. Anne just recently took on this role following 4 years as president and CEO of the Transportation Intermediaries Association, the leading advocate for 3PLs. And prior to her tenure at TIA, she spent 2 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary with the U.S. Department of Transportation and 16 years with CSX Corporation. She brings a wealth of experience and smarts to this role, and Megan and I have had the pleasure of working with Anne previously and are just so excited to have her on today. So Anne, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
You know, the amazing thing, Colleen, is that I'm only 32. I've done
there we
all
go.
of
You
these
started so
things.
young.
I really did. I'm sort of a prodigy of sorts, if you will. That's not true. That's not true at all. Anyway, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I'd love to know, you've taken on this new role. What motivated the transition, and how are you seeing your leadership impacting IANA's future? What's in store?
Okay, well, so I did not predict that this would happen for me at all. I was approached last year, and it was sort of a casual approach. It was like, this role is coming up. The longtime leader, Joni Casey, is going to retire. She's been there 27 years. She's going to retire. And we're just, exploring. We're just seeing what's out there. And so the way it was portrayed to me, it was sort of like, yeah, they probably have somebody else in mind, but why not just go through the process? So I not to say I didn't take it seriously, but I just was sort of like, okay, it wasn't impacting my thought or what I was doing at TIA really at all. But lo and behold, they ended up being serious. And the more I went through the process, the more I wanted to be part of it. And how can I explain it? It's not that I wanted to leave TIA. It was more that I wanted to go there because I saw really some opportunity. First of all, I would use my railroad side of my brain again, which I haven't used for 4 years. And those people at TIA, those lovely folk, I would bore them to tears with my railroad stories, and they're like, "Oh my God, stop it. I don't want to hear about it." So I had to go to some people who want to talk about railroads. No, that's it. Anyway, but that was part of it, right? Because I did it for so long, and it's something I'm comfortable with, but I'm also interested in. So that was part of it. The other part of it was that they were looking to me because the board had determined they wanted to be far more visible. They wanted to be far more public facing, and that's my skill set. That's what I was, have been doing my whole career, is to get in front of various public facing audiences to talk about the virtues of whatever the industry is, whether it's CSX, whether it's, TIA. And so I saw that I could really create a team. We don't have a government affairs team at all. We don't really have much advocacy practice, which is not to say that we don't do it. It's just that it wasn't something that was prioritized to the extent I think it should be. And, people are different leaders. My predecessor was very focused on the industry, how we can benefit the industry through the sort of programs that IANA runs, which is incredibly important. But how do we get people to know about it if we're not out there in the public? So that's sort of, she set me up for success in terms of, having a very stable, financially, fiscally, sound institution. And I can use what she created to get more people invested in understanding of what intermodal is.
I love that vision, and that, okay, I'm not just going to keep doing what's been working. I'm going to take this to the next level, really. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, there are all different kinds of leaders, and I know you guys are talking about leadership. So we can delve into that issue a little bit more, but there are all kinds of leaders, and my sort of leadership, I think, vision, it is that we have to be kind of proselytizers. You can't just like, okay, well, we'll block and tackle, but I have people to block and tackle. Like, I will be out there. I will do what, the good stuff. You guys are blocking, tackling. I'm going to be out there talking strategy and getting in front of people. And if our mission is to grow intermodal, which it is, then that is a tool in the toolkit to be out there and visible, whether it's advocacy or PR or communications or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of looking back then instead, looking at those 4 years at TIA, what challenges did you face? What were those most significant challenges, and how did you, in your leadership role there, work to overcome that?
Well, maybe I'm becoming a reputation of like coming on into organizations after they've had a leader for 20 years or 27 years, because I also came in after a leader had left and he had been there for 20 years. And the team at that point had to get used to a couple of things. One was me, right? But the other was a sense of empowerment. They had not necessarily been empowered to make decisions that would fit what their department needed to do, what their sort of skill set would require. And so the first thing I did was empower them. And the way I did it was, one of the ways was I involved them in the budgeting process, which seems silly, like such a small thing, but they had never been part of the budgeting process before. And so to me, and maybe it's just sheer like laziness more than anything else, but I think it's critical to have the people that work on your team do the stuff that they're supposed to do, and you rely on their judgment. And maybe there'll be times where you disagree, but ultimately, if that's what they're paid to do, then they need to do their job, and then you can just rest easy. Okay, they're doing their job, I'm going to focus on other things. And so it was a cultural shift at TI. And work is never done, there's always more to do. And now Chris Burrows is taking his hand, and he's doing a great job. But I think to me that was the most important thing. And then surviving through the pandemic so that we were actually whole and able to, resume meeting, external meetings again. That was something else that we worked on.
I think that's such a great point that you involved them in the budget, because I do think that that lends each person the feeling that they are really part of it, not just sort of a cog in a wheel. And, having, began at lower levels in an association when I first started. It's nice to be told that. It's nice. I feel like it's a form of respect
Right.
that you show them and that they will then return. So I feel like that's a really good point. So we talked about your extensive background, that you were, at the Department of
When
Transportation,
you were
and
just a teenager.
when you
I
were,
know,
yes,
right? I was only 18 years old. I'm like
right.
the people working for Elon Musk at Doge right now, right?
Exactly.
Oh my god.
Exactly. He would be a year
Hot
younger
take.
than you.
Hot take.
But how would you say that, the Department of Transportation, CSX Corporation, how they've shaped your approach to leadership, like within associations? Because they are not associations. So you came from the
No.
outside world into an association.
Gosh, there's so much to say in that one sentence, that one question, Megan. Where do I even start? No. So I'll say a couple things. One is, with a corporation, it's obviously very different. It's a very corporate, and this is, I'm repeating the word, but it's a very corporate mindset where you sort of dot your I's and cross your T's, and you're it's very structured. And it's not to say that a creativity isn't allowed, but there's a designated process for almost everything. And the way that conversations filter and the way that people get ideas and move ideas forward is very, very structured. And so I do think that is helpful. I think that has lent itself to me being pretty structured, so that, and I'll talk about DOT in a second, but when I got to TIA, I felt like there needed to be more structure. And here at IANA too, there are some things that they're already put in place, but we can sort of modernize them and make them a little bit better and tighter and neater and all of that stuff. I think that's important, and why it's kind of the stuff that you forget about, but if you don't do, it can make you all go kind of rudderless. Like you need to have those kind of lines of demarcation. Like, all right, we're going to set goals, you guys. We're going to sit down. We're going to set goals. We're going to have a meeting. We're going to talk about how we did last year. We're going to figure out what we're going to do this year. And does anyone like a 4.5 hour meeting? No, nobody likes that. But that's the stuff that corporations do, and they do it as a discipline. And so I think it's important to do that in any organization that you're involved in. So that was something I learned at CSX. At DOT, what I learned is that it's important not to talk about if you have a culture where people are talking about each other behind each other's back, that's not a trusting culture that can ultimately be productive. And unfortunately, to some extent, and who knows why, it's not like it was condoned from the top or anything like that, but it was not the kind of trusting environment that it could have been. And I am not experienced enough in different administrations to know if it differs from one to the next, but just knowing that if someone's talking bad about their coworker who's not there, you can be pretty damn certain they're going to talk bad about you behind when you're not there. And I'm sure they did, and I'm sure they regret it now because they love me so much. But the point is, not that you don't feel these things, but that you kind of keep it to yourself, and you can just bitch about your coworkers to your husband or mom or dad or cat. It is corrosive to an organization if you have that level of distrust where you're talking about your coworkers in a negative way. I'd rather you talk, if you have an issue with your coworker, you should try to figure out a way to say it directly, but not offensively. I mean, to me, it's such a hard thing to do, but it is so important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Having worked places where that has also existed, and Colleen and I have talked about this a million times, that type of environment it's contagious then. Like everybody starts doing it, and
Yeah.
there then just becomes no end in sight, and then you end up being like, man, now I have to drag myself into my office, which is not something you should be doing. You shouldn't be dragging yourself anywhere. But now I want to talk about, the transportation and intermodal sectors are so rapidly evolving. What do you see as the most pressing challenges that you're currently facing at IANA, and how are you addressing them?
Yeah, so there are a couple things that work. First of all, the freight marketplace, because you guys work with TIA, the freight marketplace has been challenged since the dizzying heights of the pandemic, where there was so much volume and a lot of people got into the freight industry, whether as brokers or truck drivers or what have you. And so since that time, it's obviously been pretty flat to down. And so having an industry where it's doing okay but not great, that can be challenging because you've got to maintain all the sort of, again, the circuitry of what helps them. But you also have to do it in such a way that there is like people feel encouraged, like we're doing the right stuff, the things are coming along, hang in there, right? So that from an economic perspective, it can be challenging. From a regulatory perspective, there are some challenges. One is we don't know what's going to happen, right? So we have a new administration, and every day there's a new ripped from the headline, and so it's not entirely, businesses they like stability, and they don't necessarily like change, and all of that. They may appreciate the new administration for some things like a deregulatory focus, but are uncertain as to what ultimately the new administration will do, for example, tariffs. And so that can be destabilizing. So from there, you really have to pick your battles. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to get our association to develop a muscle memory around, which is, you don't have to say, we hate tariffs and they suck, but you can figure out a way to say, this is what happens if tariffs are imposed to our members, and trying to nuance that a little bit. So the regulatory challenges can be challenging. And then I think the last thing, and you hear about this all the time at TIA, is that we're still dealing with this explosion of cargo theft and fraud. And so when you already have this kind of down economic cycle, you already have these regulatory uncertainty, and then on top of that, you had cargo theft, and it's seemingly not being enforced in any way. I mean, I think that's changing to some extent because of the good work that TIA has done and others. It can be like, what are we doing here? Why are we even in business? And so I think all we have to just coalesce around that, listening to our members. And I'm going to digress for just a second, but get back to my point. 2 weeks ago, I was visiting members in Jacksonville, and every single one of them mentioned cargo theft as being a challenge for them. And so, what can we do at IANA to make sure that we're being responsive? And so, we are developing a working group, and we're making sure we're going to figure out as much as we can do on the advocacy side, but also best practices side. So, those are three things that occur to me.
And I mean, that is a lot to have like on your plate to be dealing with. And now, we have a new administration, but you have, extensive government affairs background. So how do you plan to enhance your advocacy efforts to benefit like your members as well as the whole broader intermodal community?
Yeah, so we have our membership, we have 5 different types of members, and they're disparate. You have the dray carriers, you have railroads, you have the ocean going vessels, you have the equipment providers, and then you have our associate members, which can include the beneficial cargo owners. And so prior to me arriving, what I was told was that those groups don't really agree to much, which I can see. I mean, there are certainly disparate interests between them and among them. And so they will not probably agree on everything. However, and to the point you just made, Megan, I mean, if you've been in government affairs long enough, you can recognize, all right, you're not going to get everything you want, but you can get something. And so can we find those issues where, okay, not everyone's going to agree with 1,000% of what Railroad One wants, but ocean going vessel can probably say, all right, well, we don't want supply chain dysfunction. So going back to the tariffs example, of maybe they don't want to necessarily go out against Donald Trump, or they would rather just kind of stay in the background. But I bet they don't want containers to stop moving into America, right? So maybe is there something that we can do in that vein? So it really is shaping the message that you can attain, and then selling it. And so I am not one to say just because we can't all agree we should sit on the sidelines, because that doesn't benefit anybody. People need to hear your voice, and you know this because you've lived here long enough. There are 535 members of Congress. God knows they have a million things coming at them every single day. How could they possibly know what intermodal thinks, or even think to care about it, unless we're up there talking about it? So figuring out that message and then conveying it, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we did an advocacy series last month and Megan had an interview and it was so similar in line of, you might not get everything you want, but how can you position something to get a win and give everyone a win? Because that's how you do advocacy. You can't just go in, guns blazing and we want this and that's it, or you're going to walk out really unhappy.
Really unhappy. Yeah. I mean, the attention span too on these guys and gals, it's just tough. So what can you go in there and say, here, Congressman, I'm not going to cause you a problem, but I'm going to tell you what we need,
Right.
And that's honestly the most you can hope for. But we're in a society, I'm going to get on my bully pulpit now. We're in a society that doesn't like compromise. And so, it can be tough, but compromise is critical, especially for people in Washington. And hey, members of Congress, remember, compromise is important.
Love it. We'll blast that out. We'll let them all know. Listen to
Yeah, in
Anne
case they
Reinke.
forgot. In case they forgot. Yeah.
Love it. So you talked a little earlier about your leadership philosophy and how you think about how you lead and empower your team. I'd love to dive deeper into that. What are your core leadership principles and how are you using that when you think about your decision making process?
So before I started at TIA, because that was going to be my first, I mean, I had led a department, but I had never led an organization. And so I thought this would call for a sort of a special skill, and just really thoughtful approach to leadership. And so I read this book it's called Humble Leadership. And I think I've talked about this with you guys before, but what that taught me was humility. So I have 3 core principles. It's humility, transparency, and integrity. And humility is important first and foremost. What that means to me is that you don't have all the answers. And so to go back to empowerment, that means if you don't have all the answers, then you have to have a team that can help you develop all of those answers, and they will. So you don't have to go it alone. If you do go it alone, you may not have the best response. You may not have the best, function. You may not have the best priorities if you go it alone. And so humility to me is another way to say empowerment. It's another way to say I'm not a micromanager. It's that you really want your team to do what they've been told that they, what their job description tells them to do, and what they can do for the best interest of the organization. So that's one. Transparency means I am not smart enough maybe to remember what I told one person differing from what I told another person. I would, and I don't want to have different, necessarily different messages depending on who I'm talking about. You can change how you modulate, but you don't want to change the core message. And so the point of it is, if you are coordinator or if you're a vice president, I'm largely going to tell you the same thing. Maybe I'll leave out a few details if you're a coordinator, but I'm largely going to tell you the same thing because it's just important. It's important that I am being authentic and I'm telling you what I know, and I'm not going to just hide it. It's to me, I feel like transparency is important as an organization, and hiding the ball or not telling people stuff, and it's exhausting. You just forget it. And so maybe sometimes I err on the side of being too transparent. I don't know, but I'd rather be that than the other. And finally, integrity, which just means it's important to me that we do everything the right way. And you can't have an organization function for long if it does not. End of story, right? If you're not doing things the right way, you're failing your team and you're failing your organization.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. That was so well said, and I think
Yes.
such a great philosophy. I do always like to know, when I see amazing leaders, like how did you get there? And was there a key mentor or key mentors along the way, and did they impact you, and how so?
Yeah, I mean, there have been many. I hope for both of you there have been many. There's not just one. But I was just telling the story to my husband the other day because we were talking about there's a person who I don't work with, but works in another organization, who gets so mad and takes everything personally and is acting as if they're a martyr. And I asked him if he ever had felt that way about his job, and he said, no, I never. I'm just doing my job. And I said, I've only felt that once. When I came back from having my first baby, one of my job responsibilities was taken away from me and given to somebody else, and I was so pissed off about it. And I remember complaining, and my boss at the time said to me, you know what, Anne, you should go home and kick the dog. I know I've said this to you before, but it's so important, because what he was conveying without saying very much was, no, nobody really cares, right? I know you're mad, but like, get over it, right? I mean, just do the best job you can and see how you can contribute. You shouldn't be a martyr. You cannot just think the world's out to get you. These things happen. I was away for 3 months. Of course they're going to give over a critical responsibility to somebody else. Like, they're just going to wait around like, God, I wish I knew what Anne would think. Like, no, of course they're not going to do that. That doesn't make any sense. It was like a super high level issue. They're not going to be like, oh God, I can't wait till Anne comes back and we're going to get it all together. No, they're not going to do that. So his point is such a good one, and I internalized that and have never forgotten it. Like, and unfortunately there's still people, and you probably have, some too, who just feel like the world's out to get them, and it's like, all right, man, you can feel that if you want to, but don't bring it to the workplace.
Yes. Again, that would be where the contagious, like the bad thoughts, where you're like, oh God, everyone is out to get me. And half the time, you're just hoping that somebody even knows who you are, let alone that they're out to get you, depending on the organization.
Right. I mean, come on, everyone, just do your job, right? And then go home and hug your babies.
So before you mentioned those principles, and I really, they really resonate too. So as you step into this new role, what are your immediate priorities, and where do you see the organization in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so my immediate priorities are, well, one, which was to talk to everybody on the staff, which I have now. Well, I think I have one more. Talk to everybody on the staff, talk to all of my board members. From there, fan out to we have various committees, talk to the committee members, because before I can just pronounce, oh, this is wrong and we must make it right, I feel like I really need to get the perspective. This is not to say I'm paralyzed and I'm not doing anything. This is just to say, make sure that what I'm doing is well informed, because I've been able to talk to them. So this is like the listening and learning of the first 90 days. But that being said, so our headquarters is out in Maryland past the Beltway. And, the board says they want us to be more visible. So to my mind, you cannot be visible past Beltway. I'm sounding snotty, but it's true. You know this. You guys are Beltway people. You kind of have to be seen and be seen. And so one of the things I'm looking at is developing whether or not we can have a DC space, just so ultimately, if I hire a VP of Government Affairs or whatever their title is for Government Affairs, that person stays there, and they're always out there saying, running into members of Congress or running into other lobbyists or running into whatever key regulators, so that they're there and present and can pop in at the moment's notice to a meeting of any kind. That to me is so important, because so many things happen, as you know, just because you were in the right place at the right time. And if we're not ever there, then again, we will not be thought of. And we will, and what I've found already in some of the meetings I've had on Capitol Hill is people understand intermodal sort of conceptually, but they don't necessarily know the organization. And so we got to change that. And so it starts with just being up there more regularly, and then ultimately being up there consistently.
Yeah. I loved that you labeled it as a listening tour, because I think that's so important. I have worked where you get a new person to come in and they take away everything, they change everything, and I've worked where that has worked, but I do think that a more thoughtful approach to, let me take a look at what's even here before we would decide to explode it or something like that. So I love that. Last question from me. With the rise of technology in transportation, how do you foresee supporting your members in adapting to the digital transformations?
Yes, I love this, Megan. Miss Technology. Megan is Miss Technology, right? No, I'm just joking. You're not.
No, that is Colleen.
That's Colleen. Um, yeah, so you think about railroads and you think about steamship lines and you think about dray carriers. The first thought in your mind is not high tech, right? But I think ultimately that's where we can assist in a couple ways. One is we have access to a lot of data through, it's an interchange program that we administer called the Uniform Intermodal Interchange Agreement. And so what that is a registry of drivers, of equipment providers, and railroads and chassis owners, et cetera, how they can use the intermodal equipment, who has access to it, who is permitted to have access to it, right? The containers. And so there's a whole bunch of data that we have through that. We also have various data products because we have these smart people who are affiliated with us who track the volumes and all of that stuff. So can we mine that data for other uses? We have some that we are already using. We have a whole info services division that is doing a bunch of really cool stuff. And, one of the things they're working on is an equipment return location registry so that people know where their equipment is. I mean, can you imagine? Like, part of the supply chain dysfunction is no one knew where anything was. And so if we can create this tool where people know where stuff is, won't that be enormously helpful? But having visibility to me is such an important part of what we can give our members, and then getting them accustomed to using that technology on a regular basis, and so that railroads and the steamship lines and the dray carriers won't be conceived of these sort of like low tech kind of transportation modes, but they'll actually be affiliated with what we can do high tech. I think it's about visibility. I mean, and we talked about cargo theft. Visibility can be a component in that of how we can address it too. So that's when I think about how we can shape our future, that's part of it.
Great.
Yeah. I love how some tech solutions can be so simple in theory and yet make such an impact. It's just,
Yeah,
we got to
right.
figure out the easy things first, because if you can't know where stuff is,
If you don't know where
yikes.
stuff is, what are you going to do about it, right?
I know.
And so we hope for not another supply chain disaster or whatever, but it's always perilously close, right? Like the ILA potential port strike this past January, that could have put us all, not necessarily the first week, but if it lasted, it could have really put us behind the eight ball. And so anyway, we have to do more than what we're doing.
Yep. So kind of closing thought before we do our just for fun questions here.
Oh yeah, fun question.
as we focus on leadership, what is your top piece of advice you'd offer professionals in the association world that are trying to get to that leadership level. So they've come in at different levels of the association space and they want to get to that C-suite.
Ooh. Well, first of all, you shouldn't want to be in the C-suite just for the hell of it. I mean, I don't know. That sounds so dumb, but you really wanted to lead because you think you have something to offer, not because it just comes with trappings. I mean, I know that I'm not being preachy or moralistic, but I don't know. I like ambition, but you also want ambition to be channeled in the right way. So that would be my first thing that I would say. But the second thing I would say is this is do your job really well. Whatever existing job you have today, if it's not, you're not the current C-suite leader, do your job really well and don't focus too much on, well, I want to be an executive by the time I'm 35 or whatever. If you do your job the right way and are engaged in making the organization that you work for better, you know, people will take notice. The members will take notice. The members will say, I really like, guy or gal X or Z because they do this for me. And so, there are a lot of people in life who fail upwards because they're always like focused on the next job before they finish their first job. Please don't do that. Please do your job well and do as much as you can to do it in a competent, friendly, and sort of, all in it together way. That would be my advice. That's
So
it.
That's
good.
great advice. All right, so we wrap up every podcast with just for fun questions in a lightning round style so our audience can get to know you.
Okay, love
Have
it.
have you recently traveled anywhere fun lately?
Well, I was just in Atlanta, and that doesn't count. No, but is it recent last year?
I mean, it was just last year. Yeah, it's still recent.
Because otherwise it's like Atlanta, Jacksonville, and where did I go last week? I went somewhere else. Where was that? I don't even remember. Oh, Fort Lauderdale. Okay. So last year I took my family to Croatia and it was unbelievable. It was so fun.
That sounds,
It's
yes,
amazing.
amazing. So, besides the Association Insights podcast, of course, do you listen to podcasts? And if so, what would you recommend to our listeners?
Okay, so you guys are probably super podcasty because you're younger than I am, but I listen to Honestly with Barry Weiss. Do you know that? Do you know that one?
No.
I don't
What
know
is
that
that
one.
about?
Oh my God, you guys, come on. Would you listen to
Elaine's writing it down
write it
because
down? Because
she
she maybe
will
asked
watch
about it.
that, and I only listen to murder
Oh yes,
podcasts.
I know. You know what? And this is a slight digression too. That the target audience for true crime are women over the age of 40.
Yeah.
Do you know this?
Yep.
Yes.
That's you,
And
Megan. That's you.
I literally I mean it's becoming a problem. Like I say to my husband all the time, I should have been a detective.
There's some things that are still unsolved, Megan, if you want to get involved in
I
that.
know. I know.
Right?
Maybe this will be a new career for me.
I mean, for
It
your
could
husband's
be.
sake, I'm glad that's the direction you went and not the I could get away with this.
Yeah, I'm going to start plotting and planning.
I
Well,
will be good at this.
there are some really good true crime podcasts out there. I've heard a couple, but so the Barry Weiss one is she was a former New York Times reporter, and then she got canceled, excommunicated by the New York Times folks because I think she said something that was slightly moderate. And so then she started, which is not, that's me making a lot of judgments, but she has a podcast where she has people on the left and the right, and she just really wants to have good conversations because she's not judging whether or not someone's right or wrong, which I appreciate because I think honestly more open dialogue is better, and don't be so wedded to your beliefs. So I love Barry Weiss. That's my there we go. There's
I'm
my
gonna check
recommendation.
that out. I'll see if she can compete with my
With your
murderers.
true murder.
So, what's one place in the United States you've never been to but are dying to go?
Oof, golly. All right, I've never been to the coast of Alabama. And I mean, I've driven through it on I-10, which I'm sure all of us have done, but I've never spent a whole lot of time out. And there seems to be, I'm forgetting the name of the town now, but there's some super cute places that look like romantic and beautiful and have history behind them. So I would like to go there. There we go. I've not been.
Perfect. So, finish the sentence. When you see me looking at my phone, it probably means that I'm.
Well, I mean, checking email, but if it's not checking email, that's probably reading the Wall Street Journal. I love the Wall Street Journal.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun because you're so much fun. So this was great.
The audience at home doesn't know that I'm raising my arms like Rocky.
Too funny. Awesome. Thanks again, Anne. This was great.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association Insights Podcast, previously known as the Association 100 Podcast, is a production of Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of our newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association? Or do you have some words of wisdom from the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwrdupwrd.com. Be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association insights and inspiration. Thanks for tuning in.